Section 28 of the History of Rome, Volume 3, by Livy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Rita Boutros. Book 25, The Fall of Syracuse. Chapters 16 through 22. Chapter 16. The Death of Tiberius Gracchus. Before he left Lucania, a most ill-omened portent happened to Gracchus whilst he was offering sacrifice. The sacrifice itself was just finished, when two snakes glided unobserved up to the reserved parts of the victim and devoured the liver. As soon as they were seen, they suddenly disappeared. On the advice of the augurs, a fresh sacrifice was offered, and the parts reserved with greater care. But according to the tradition, the same thing happened a second and even a third time. The snakes glided up, and after tasting the liver, slipped away untouched. The augurs warned the commander that the portent concerned him, and they bade him be on his guard against secret foes and secret plots. But no foresight could avert the impending doom. There was a Lucanian named Flavus, the head of that section of the Lucanians who stood by Rome. One section had gone over to Hannibal, and they elected him praetor. He had already been a year in office when suddenly he changed his mind, and began to look out for an opportunity of ingratiating himself with the Carthaginians. He did not think it enough to go over himself and draw the Lucanians with him into revolt, unless he could make his league with the enemy sure by the life-blood of the very man who was his guest friend, and betray the Roman commander. He had a secret interview with Mago, who was commanding in Bruttium, and obtained his solemn pledge that if he would betray the Roman commander to the Carthaginians, the Lucanians should be taken into friendship, and allowed to live as a free people under their own laws. He then took Mago to the spot where he said he would bring Gracchus with a small escort. Mago was to bring foot and horse fully armed to the place, and place a large force in concealment. After the spot had been thoroughly examined, and an investigation made of every part, a day was fixed for carrying out the project. Flavus went to the Roman commander and told him that he had an important enterprise on hand, and required Gracchus's help for its accomplishment. He had persuaded the chief magistrates of all the communities, which, in the general disturbance of Italy, had seceded to the Carthaginians, to return to friendship with Rome, since the cause of Rome, which had been all but ruined at Cannae, was every day becoming stronger and more popular, while the strength of Hannibal was waning, and had almost reached the vanishing point. The Romans, he knew, would not be implacable to those who had formerly offended. There had never been a nation more ready to listen to prayers and more quick to grant forgiveness. How often had they pardoned even their own ancestors after their repeated renewal of hostilities? This was the language he had addressed to them. But, he went on, they would rather hear all this from Gracchus himself in person, and touch his right hand, and carry away with them that pledge of good faith. He explained that he had mentioned a place to those whom he had taken into confidence, not far from the Roman camp, and only a few words would be needed so as to arrange matters there, that the entire Lucanian nation would become faithful allies of Rome. Gracchus, impressed by the apparent sincerity of the man's language and the proposal he made, and carried away by his smooth and plausible address, started from camp with his lictors and a troop of cavalry, under the guidance of his guest friend. He rode straight into the snare. Suddenly enemies showed themselves on all sides, and to take away all doubt as to his being betrayed, Flavus joined them. Missiles were hurled from every quarter upon Gracchus and his cavalry. He sprung from his horse, and ordered the rest to do the same, and called upon them to make the one thing which fortune had left them glorious by their courage. "For what is left," he cried, "to a little band surrounded by an enormous host, in a valley shut in by forest and mountain, except death? The one question is, are you going to offer yourselves like cattle to be butchered without striking a blow? Or are you going to turn all your thoughts from passively awaiting the end, and make a fierce and furious onslaught, doing and daring until you fall, covered with your enemy's blood, amidst the heaped up bodies and arms of your dying foes? Make, every one of you, for the Lucanian traitor and renegade. The man who sends him beforehand as a victim to the gods below will find in his own death a glorious honor and unspeakable consolation." While saying this, he wound his paludimentum round his left arm, for they had not even brought their shields with them, and charged the enemy. There was more fighting than might have been expected from the number of the combatants. The Romans were most exposed to the darts, and as they were hurled from the higher ground all round, they were pierced by them. Gracchus was now left without any defense, and the Carthaginians tried to take him alive. But catching sight of his Lucanian guest friend amongst the enemy, he made such a furious onslaught on their serried ranks that it became impossible to save his life without incurring heavy loss. Mago sent his dead body to Hannibal, and ordered it and the captured fasces to be placed before the general's tribunal. If this is the true story, Gracchus perished in Lucania at the place called the Old Fields. Chapter 17. There are some who point to a place in the neighborhood of Beneventum, near the river Calor, as the scene of his death. He had left the camp with his lictors and 3 attendants to bathe in the river, whilst the enemy were concealed in osier beds on the bank, and whilst naked and defenseless was killed, after vainly endeavoring to drive off the enemy by stones from the bed of the river. Others say that, acting on the advice of the augurs, he had gone about half a mile from the camp, for the purpose of averting the above-mentioned portents in a place free from defilement, when he was surrounded by 2 squadrons of Numidians, who happened to have taken up their position there. So little agreement is there as to the place and circumstances of the death of this brilliant and famous man. And there are different versions of the account of his funeral. Some say that his men buried him in his own camp. Others say that he was buried by Hannibal, and this is the more generally accepted account. According to this version, a funeral pyre was erected on the open space in front of the camp, and the whole army, fully accoutred, went through various evolutions with Spanish dances and the movements of limbs and weapons peculiar to each tribe, Hannibal doing honor to the dead in every way by his acts and words. This is the account given by those who say that his death took place in Lucania. If you choose to believe those who place it at the river Calor, it would appear that the enemy only got possession of the head. This was sent to Hannibal, and he at once dispatched Carthallo to carry it to Gnaeus Cornelius the quaestor, who carried out the obsequies in the Roman camp, the people of Beneventum taking their part in the ceremony as well as the soldiers. Chapter 18. Renewal of the fighting round Capua. The consuls had invaded the territory of Capua, and were devastating it far and wide, when great alarm and confusion were caused by a sudden sortie of the townsmen, supported by Mago and his troopers. They hurriedly recalled to the standards the men who were scattered in all directions, but they had hardly time to form their line before they were routed and lost more than 1,500 men. The self-confidence and arrogance of the people of Capua were immensely strengthened by this success, and they were continually challenging the Romans to fight. But that one engagement brought about by want of caution and foresight put the consuls much more on their guard. An incident occurred, however, which put heart into the Romans, and lessened the confidence of the other side. An insignificant one, it is true, but in war nothing is so insignificant as not sometimes to involve serious consequences. Titus Quinctius Crispinus had a friend in Capua called Badius, and their friendship was a very close and intimate one. The intimacy had been formed before the defection of Capua, when Badius was lying ill in Rome at Crispinus's house, and received the kindest and most careful attention from his host. One day this Badius walked up to the sentinels on duty before the camp gate, and asked them to call Crispinus. Crispinus, on receiving the message, imagined that he had not forgotten the old ties of friendship, even though public treaties were torn up, and that he wanted a friendly and familiar talk, and accordingly he went on a short distance from his comrades. As soon as they came in sight of one another, Badius called out, "I, Badius, challenge you, Crispinus, to battle. Let us mount our horses, and when the others have withdrawn, decide who of us is the better fighter." Crispinus replied that neither he nor his challenger lacked enemies upon whom they could display their courage, but as for himself, even if he met Badius on the field of battle, he would avoid him sooner than pollute his right hand with a friend's blood. Then he turned round, and was in the act of departing, when Badius became more insolent, and began to taunt him with effeminacy and cowardice, and hurled at him abusive epithets, which he himself more properly deserved. He said that he was an enemy masquerading as a friend, and pretending to spare a man for whom he knew he was no match. If he were under the impression that when the bonds which held states together were broken, the bonds of private friendship were not broken at the same time, then he, Badius of Capua, openly renounced in the hearing of both armies the friendship of Titus Quinctius Crispinus the Roman. "There is," he went on, "no fellowship, no bond of alliance between foe and foe, between me and the man who has come to attack my home, my country, and my country's gods. If you are a man, meet me." For a long time Crispinus hesitated, but the men of his troop at last prevailed upon him not to let the Campanian insult him with impunity, and so, only waiting till he could ask his commanders if they would allow him, against regulations, to fight an enemy who challenged him, he mounted his horse with their permission, and called upon Badius by name to come out and fight. The Campanian showed no hesitation. They spurred their horses against each other and met. Crispinus with his lance wounded Badius in his left shoulder above his shield. He fell from his horse, and Crispinus leaped down from the saddle to dispatch him as he lay. Badius, before he was overpowered, escaped to his comrades, leaving shield and horse behind. Crispinus, proudly displaying his spoils, the horse and shield which he had taken, was conducted amid the cheers and congratulations of the soldiers to the consuls. Here he was addressed in terms of high praise, and loaded with gifts. Chapter 19. Hannibal left the neighborhood of Beneventum, and encamped close to Capua. 3 days afterwards he led out his force to battle, feeling quite certain that as the Campanians had fought a successful action a short time before in his absence, the Romans would be far less able to withstand him and the army which had been so often victorious. As soon as the battle commenced, the Roman line was in difficulties, chiefly owing to the attack of cavalry, as they were almost overwhelmed by their darts. The signal was given for the Roman cavalry to charge the enemy at full gallop, and now it had become simply a cavalry engagement, when the sight of Sempronius's army in the distance, commanded by Gnaeus Cornelius, created equal alarm on both sides, as each feared that a fresh enemy was coming on. The signal to retire was given in both armies as if by mutual consent, and the combatants separated on almost equal terms and returned to camp. The loss on the Roman side was, however, somewhat the greater, owing to the cavalry attack at the beginning. In order to draw Hannibal away from Capua, the consuls left in the night after the battle for different destinations. Fulvius went into the neighborhood of Cumae, and Claudius into Lucania. On being informed the next day that the Roman camp was evacuated, and that they had gone in 2 divisions by different routes, Hannibal was at first undecided which he should follow. He decided to follow Appius. After leading his enemy about just as he pleased, Appius returned by a circuitous route to Capua. Another chance of achieving success in this country presented itself to Hannibal. There was a certain Marcus Centenius, surnamed Penula, who was conspicuous among the centurions of the first rank for his physical stature and his courage. After completing his period of service, he was introduced by Publius Cornelius Sulla, the praetor, to the Senate. He requested the senators to allow him 5,000 men. He was well acquainted with the enemy and the country where he was operating, and would very soon do something worth the doing. The tactics by which our generals and their armies had been outwitted up to that time he would employ against the man who invented them. Stupid as the promise was, it was quite as stupidly given credence to, as though the qualifications of a soldier were the same as those of a general. Instead of 5,000, he was given 8,000 men, half of them Romans and half troops furnished by the allies. He himself, too, picked up a considerable number of volunteers in the country through which he was marching, and he arrived in Lucania with double the army he started with. Here Hannibal had come to a halt after his fruitless pursuit of Claudius. The result could not be doubtful, seeing it was a contest between armies, one of which consisted of veterans habituated to victory, the other a hastily raised and half-armed force. As soon as they caught sight of each other, neither side declined battle, and they at once got into fighting order. For more than 2 hours, however, in spite of the utterly unequal conditions, the Roman army kept up the fighting as long as their leader stood his ground. At last, out of regard for his former reputation, and also fearing the disgrace he would incur if he survived a defeat brought on by his own headlong folly, he rushed upon the weapons of the foe and fell, and the Roman army was instantly routed. But even when they fled, they found no way of escape, for all avenues were closed by the cavalry, so that out of that multitude of men only 1,000 escaped. All the rest perished in one way or another. Chapter 20. Investment of Capua. The consuls now resumed the siege of Capua in earnest, and everything necessary for the task was brought together and got into readiness. Corn was stored at Casilinum. At the mouth of the Vulturnus, where the town of Vulturnum now stands, a fort was constructed, and a garrison was placed in it, and in Puteoli also, which Fabius had previously fortified, so that they might command both the river and the adjacent sea. The corn which had lately been sent from Sardinia, as well as that which Marcus Junius had purchased in Etruria, was conveyed from Ostia into these two maritime fortresses, that the army might have a supply throughout the winter. Meantime, the disaster which had overtaken Centenius in Lucania was aggravated by another, which resulted from the death of Gracchus. The volunteer slaves, who had done excellent service when he was alive to lead them, looked upon his death as discharging them from further military duties, and accordingly disbanded themselves. Hannibal was anxious not to neglect Capua, or desert friends who were in such a critical position, but after his easy victory through the foolhardiness of one Roman general, he was watching for an opportunity of crushing another. Envoys from Apulia had informed him that Gnaeus Fulvius, who was attacking some of their cities which had seceded to him, had at first conducted his operations with care and prudence, but afterwards, intoxicated with success and loaded with plunder, he and his men had given themselves up to such idleness and self-indulgence that all military discipline had disappeared. Hannibal knew by repeated experience, and especially within the last few days, what state an army gets into under an incompetent commander, and he at once moved into Apulia. Chapter 21. Fulvius and his legions were in the neighborhood of Heraclea. When they heard that the enemy were approaching, they were almost on the point of dragging up the standards and going into battle without waiting for orders. In fact, the one thing that restrained them more than anything else was the confidence they felt of being able to choose their own time for fighting. The following night, when Hannibal became aware that the camp was in a state of tumult, and that most of the men were defying their commander, and insisting that he should give the signal, and that there was a general cry, "To arms!" he was quite certain that the opportunity was presented of a successful battle. He quietly disposed some 3,000 of his light infantry in the surrounding homesteads and in the woods and copses. They were all to spring from their concealment at the same moment when the signal was given, and Mago had orders to place about 2,000 cavalry along all the roads which he thought the direction of the flight might take. After making these dispositions during the night, he marched out to battle at dawn. Fulvius did not hesitate, though he was not drawn on so much by any hopes of success on his own part, as by the blind impetuosity of his men. The same recklessness which sent them on to the field appeared in the formation of their line. They went forward in a haphazard way, and took their places in the ranks just where they chose, and left them again as their caprices or fears dictated. The first legion and the left wing of the allies were drawn up in front, and the line was extended far beyond its proper length. The officers called out that it possessed neither strength nor depth, and wherever the enemy made their attack, they would break through. But the men would not even listen to, much less attend to, anything that was for their good. And now Hannibal was upon them, a general so different from their own, with an army so different and in such different order. As might be expected, the Romans were unable to withstand the very first attack. Their general, quite as foolish and reckless as Centenius, though not to be compared with him in courage, no sooner saw the day going against him and his men in confusion than he seized a horse and made his escape with about 200 of his cavalry. The rest of the army, repulsed in front and then surrounded in rear and flanks, was so completely cut up that out of 12,000 men not more than 2,000 escaped. The camp was taken. Chapter 22. The news of these disasters, one after another, created very great grief and alarm amongst the citizens in Rome. Still, as they knew that the consuls were so far successful where success was most important, they were not so much disturbed by the tidings as they might have been. The Senate dispatched Gaius Laetorius and Marcus Metilius with instructions to the consuls, telling them to carefully get together the remains of the two armies, and to see to it that the survivors were not driven by fear and despair to surrender to the enemy, as had happened after the disaster at Cannae. They were also to find out who had deserted amongst the volunteer slaves. Publius Cornelius also was charged with this latter task, as he was with the raising of fresh troops, and he caused notices to be published through the market towns and boroughs, ordering that search should be made for the volunteer slaves, and that they should be brought back to their standards. These instructions were all most carefully carried out. Appius Claudius placed Decimus Junius in command at the mouth of the Vulturnus, and Marcus Aurelius Cotta at Puteoli. Whenever the vessels arrived from Etruria and Sardinia, they were at once to have the corn sent on to the camp. Claudius then returned to Capua, and found his colleague Quintus Fulvius bringing everything from Casilinum, and making preparations to attack the city. Both of them now commenced the investment of the place, and they summoned the praetor Claudius Nero, who was in Claudius's old camp at Suessula. He, too, leaving a small force to hold the position, came down with the rest of his army to Capua. So 3 commanders had their headquarters now established round Capua, and 3 armies working on different sides were preparing to ring the city round with fosse and dike. They erected blockhouses at certain intervals, and battles took place in several places at once with the Campanians, as they tried to stop the work, the result being that at last the Campanians kept within their walls and gates. Before, however, the circle of investment was completed, envoys were dispatched to Hannibal to remonstrate with him for having abandoned Capua, which was now almost restored to the Romans, and to implore him to bring them succor now, at all events, as they were no longer merely besieged, but completely blockaded. A dispatch was sent to the consuls by Publius Cornelius, bidding them give an opportunity to the inhabitants, before they completed the investment, of leaving the place and carrying away their property with them. Those who left before the 15th of March would be free, and remain in possession of all their property. After that date, those who left and those who remained would be alike treated as enemies. When this offer was announced to the Campanians, they treated it not only with scorn, but with gratuitous insults and threats as well. Shortly before this, Hannibal had left Herdonia for Tarentum in the hope of acquiring the place either by treachery or by force, and as he failed to do so, he bent his course towards Brundisium, under the impression that the town would surrender. It was whilst he was spending time here to no purpose that the envoys from Capua came to him with their remonstrances and appeals. Hannibal answered them in high-sounding words. He had raised the siege of Capua once already, and the consuls would not wait for his approach, even now. Dismissed with this hope, the envoys had considerable difficulty in getting back to Capua, surrounded as it now was, with a double fosse and rampart. End of section 28. Section 29 of the History of Rome, Volume 3, by Livy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Rita Boutros. Book 25, The Fall of Syracuse. Chapters 23 to 31. Chapter 23, The Conquest of Syracuse. Just when the circumvallation of Capua was being completed, the siege of Syracuse came to an end. This result was due, in a large measure, to the energy and courage of the general and his army, but it had been helped on by domestic treachery. At the commencement of the spring, Marcellus was undecided whether to turn the stress of war to Agrigentum against Himilco and Hippocrates, or whether he should press the siege of Syracuse. He saw that this place could not be carried by assault, as it was unassailable by sea or land, owing to its position, nor could it be reduced by famine, since it was nourished by a free supply of provisions from Carthage. However, he determined to leave nothing untried. There were with the Romans some leading members of the Syracusan nobility, who had been expelled when the defection took place, and Marcellus told these refugees to sound the feelings of the men of their own party, and give them an assurance that if Syracuse were surrendered, they should be free and live under their own laws. It was impossible to get any chance of interviews, for the fact of many being suspected made all more careful and watchful, so that no attempt of the kind should escape detection. A slave belonging to the exiles was admitted into the city as a deserter, and after getting a few men together, broached the subject in conversation. Subsequently, some were hidden under the nets in a fishing boat, and in that way taken round to the Roman camp, where they had conversations with the refugees. Different people, one after another, did the same thing, until at last there were as many as 80 concerned in the matter. When all the arrangements for surrender had been made, information was given to Apicides by a certain Attalus, who resented not having been entrusted with the secret, and they were all tortured to death. This hope, which had proved so illusory, was soon succeeded by another. A certain Damipus, a Lacedaemonian, had been sent from Syracuse on a mission to King Philip, and was captured by some Roman ships. Apicides was particularly anxious to ransom this man, and Marcellus raised no objection, as just at that time the Romans were bidding for the friendship of the Aetolians, with whom the Lacedaemonians were in alliance. Those who were sent to discuss the terms of the ransom thought that the most central place for the conference, and the one most convenient to both sides, was a spot near the tower called Galliagra at the Trogilian port. As they went to and fro there several times, one of the Romans took a near view of the wall, counted the stones, and formed an estimate in his mind of the thickness of each stone. Having thus calculated the height of the wall as well as he could by conjecture, and finding it lower than he or anyone else had supposed, and capable of being scaled by a ladder of even moderate length, he made a report to the consul. Marcellus attached considerable importance to his suggestion, but as that part of the wall being lower was for that very reason more carefully guarded, it was impossible to approach it, and they had to watch their opportunity, which soon came. A deserter brought word that the townspeople were keeping the festival of Diana, which lasted 3 days, and that, through lack of other things, owing to the siege, they were celebrating the feast mostly with wine, which Apicides had distributed amongst the populace, and the leading citizens amongst the tribes. On hearing this, Marcellus talked the matter over with a few of the military tribunes, and through them selected the centurions and private soldiers who were fittest for such a daring enterprise. Scaling ladders were quietly got ready, and then all the rest of the men were ordered to seek refreshment and rest as soon as they could, as a nocturnal expedition was in front of them. As soon as he thought the time had come when, after feasting all day, the men would have their fill of wine and be in their first sleep, the consul ordered one maniple to carry scaling ladders, and about 1,000 men were silently marched in a narrow column up to the spot. They got up onto the wall without any confusion or noise, and others at once followed in order. Even those who felt nervous were reassured by the daring of those in front. Chapter 24. By this time 1,000 men had got possession of that section of the wall. They went on as far as the hexapylon without meeting a soul, as the majority of those on guard in the bastions were either stupid with wine after their revels, or were drinking themselves drunk. They killed a few, however, whom they surprised in their beds. When they reached the hexapylon, they gave the signal, and the rest of the troops marched up to the walls, bringing more scaling ladders with them. The postern gate near the hexapylon was giving way to the violence of the blows, and the agreed signal was given from the wall. They no longer attempted to conceal their movements, but commenced an open attack, as they had now reached Epipolae, where there was a large force on guard, and their object was now to frighten rather than elude the enemy. They succeeded perfectly, for no sooner were the notes of the trumpet heard, and the shouts of those who held the wall and a part of the city, than the men on guard thought that every part was taken, and some fled along the wall, others leaped from it, and a crowd of panic-stricken citizens took to headlong flight. A great many, however, were ignorant of the great disaster that had befallen them, for everybody was heavy with wine and sleep, and in a city of such vast extent, what was happening in one part was not known to the population generally. At daybreak Marcellus forced the gates of the hexapylon, and entered the city with his entire force, rousing the citizens, who all betook themselves to arms, prepared to render what help they could to a city which was all but captured. Epicides made a hurried march from the island, its local name is Nassos, under the impression that a few men had succeeded in scaling the walls, owing to the negligence of the guards, and that he would soon drive them out. He told the terrified fugitives whom he met that they were adding to the confusion and making things out to be more serious and alarming than they really were. When, however, he saw every place round the Epipolae full of armed men, he simply discharged a few missiles at the enemy and marched back to the Acridina, not so much through fear of the strength and numbers of the enemy, as of some opening for treason from within, which might close the gates of Acridina and the island against him in the confusion. When Marcellus mounted the fortifications and saw from his higher ground the city below him, the fairest city of the time, he is said to have shed tears at the sight, partly through joy at his great achievement, partly at the memory of its ancient glories. He thought of the Athenian fleets which had been sunk in that harbor, of the 2 great armies with their famous generals which had been annihilated there, of all of its many powerful kings and tyrants, above all of Hiero, whose memory was so fresh, and who, in addition to all his endowments of fortune and character, had distinguished himself by his services to Rome. As all this passed through his mind, and with it the thought that in one short hour all he saw round him would be burnt and reduced to ashes, he decided, before advancing against Acridina, to send the Syracusans, who, as already stated, were with the Roman troops, into the city, to try if kind words could induce the enemy to surrender the place. Chapter 25. The gates and walls of Achradina were mostly held by the deserters, who were hopeless of obtaining mercy on any terms, and they allowed no one to approach the walls or to speak to them. So Marcellus, finding that his project had failed, ordered the troops to return to Euryalus. This was a hill in the furthest part of the city, away from the sea, and overlooking the road which leads into the country and the inland part of the island. It was therefore admirably adapted for the reception of supplies from the interior. The command of the citadel here had been entrusted by Epicides to Philodemus, an Argive. Sosus, one of the regicides, had been sent by Marcellus to open up negotiations, but after a long conversation, in which he found himself put off with evasive replies, he reported to Marcellus that Philodemus was taking time for consideration. He continued to procrastinate from day to day, to allow time for Hippocrates and Himilco to bring up their legions, feeling quite sure that if he had them in his stronghold, the Romans would be shut up within the walls and annihilated. As Marcellus saw that Euryalus could not be taken by either treachery or force, he established his camp between Neapolis and Tycha, parts of the city, and almost cities in themselves, as he was afraid if he entered the more populous parts, he would not be able to keep his soldiers from dispersing in their eagerness for plunder. Envoys came to him from these two places with olive branches and woolen fillets, imploring him that they might be spared from fire and sword. Marcellus held a council of war to consider this request, or rather this entreaty, and in accordance with the wish of all present, he gave notice to the soldiers that they were not to lay hands on any free citizen. Everything else they were at liberty to appropriate. Instead of fosse and rampart, the camp was protected by the private houses, which served it for walls, and sentinels and pickets were posted at the gates of the houses which stood open to the street, to secure the camp against attack, while the soldiers were dispersed in the city. After this, the signal was given, and the soldiers ran in all directions, breaking open the house doors, and filling everything with uproar and panic, but they refrained from bloodshed. There was no limit to the work of rapine, until they had cleared the houses of all the goods and possessions which had been accumulating during the long spell of prosperity. Whilst this was going on, Philomenus saw that there was no hope of succor, and after getting the promise of a safe conduct for him to return to Epicides, he withdrew his garrison, and handed the position over to the Romans. Whilst everybody was preoccupied with the tumult in the captured part of the city, Bomilcar seized the opportunity to escape. The night was a tempestuous one, and the Roman fleet were unable to keep their anchorage off the harbor, so he slipped out with 35 ships, and finding the sea clear, set sail for Carthage, leaving 55 ships for Epicides and the Syracusans. After making the Carthaginians realize the critical state of affairs at Syracuse, he returned with 100 ships a few days later, and was rewarded, so they say, by Epicides with gifts from Hiero's treasury. Chapter 26. The capture of Euryalus and its occupation by a Roman garrison relieved Marcellus of one cause of anxiety. He had no longer to dread an attack from the rear, which might have created confusion amongst his men, shut in and hampered as they were by walls. His next move was against Achradina. He established 3 separate camps in suitable positions, and sat down before the place, hoping to reduce it by famine. For some days the outposts were undisturbed, when the sudden arrival of Hippocrates and Himilco led to a general attack upon the Roman lines. Hippocrates had formed an entrenched camp at the great harbor, and after giving a signal to the troops in Achradina, he made an attack on the old camp of the Romans, which Crispinus commanded. Epicides made a sortie against Marcellus, and the Carthaginian fleet, which lay between the city and the Roman camp, was brought ashore, and so prevented Crispinus from sending any help to Marcellus. The excitement which the enemy caused was, however, much more alarming than the fighting, for Crispinus not only drove Hippocrates back from his entrenchments, but actually went in pursuit as he fled hurriedly away, whilst Marcellus drove Epicides back into the city. And now apparently ample provision was made against danger arising from any sudden attacks in the future. To add to their troubles, both sides were visited by pestilence, a calamity almost heavy enough to turn them from all thoughts of war. It was the time of autumn, and the locality was naturally unhealthy, more so, however, outside the city than within it, and the insupportable heat affected the constitutions of almost all who were in the two camps. In the beginning, people fell ill and died through the effects of the season and the unhealthy locality. Later, the nursing of the sick and contact with them spread the disease, so that either those who had caught it died neglected and abandoned, or else they carried off with them those who were waiting on them and nursing them, and who had thus become infected. Deaths and funerals were a daily spectacle. On all sides, day and night, were heard the wailings for the dead. At last, familiarity with misery so brutalized men that not only would they not follow the dead with tears and the lamentations which custom demanded, but they actually refused to carry them out for burial, and the lifeless bodies were left lying about before the eyes of those who were awaiting a similar death. So what with fear and the foul and deadly miasma arising from the bodies, the dead proved fatal to the sick, and the sick equally fatal to those in health. Men preferred to die by the sword. Some, single-handed, attacked the enemy's outposts. The epidemic was much more prevalent in the Carthaginian camp than in those of the Romans, for their long investment of Syracuse had made them more accustomed to the climate and to the water. The Sicilians who were in the hostile ranks deserted as soon as they saw that the disease was spreading through the unhealthiness of the place, and went off to their own cities. The Carthaginians, who had nowhere to go to, perished to a man together with their generals, Hippocrates and Himilco. When the disease assumed such serious proportions, Marcellus transferred his men to the city, and those who had been weakened by sickness were restored by shade and shelter. Still, many of the Roman soldiers, too, were carried off by that pestilence. Chapter 27. When the land army of the Carthaginians had been thus wiped out, the Sicilians, who had been with Hippocrates, took possession of 2 walled towns, not large ones certainly, but made safe by their situation and strong fortifications. One was 3 miles from Syracuse, the other 15. They carried supplies to these towns from their own states, and asked for reinforcements. Bomilcar had in the meantime paid a second visit to Carthage with his fleet, and had drawn such a picture of the state of things in Syracuse as to lead the government to hope that they might not only render effectual assistance to their friends, but even succeed in capturing the Romans inside that city, which they had in some measure captured. He persuaded them to dispatch as many cargo ships as they could, laden with stores of all kinds, and also to augment his force of fighting ships. The result was that he left Carthage with 130 ships of war and 700 transports. The winds were favorable for him whilst sailing for Sicily, but they prevented him from rounding the promontory of Pacanus. The news of Bomilcar's approach, and then his unexpected delay, excited first hope and then fear amongst the Syracusans, and just the reverse among the Romans. Epicides was afraid that if the east wind lasted much longer, the Carthaginian fleet would return to Africa, and he handed Acradina over to the commanders of the mercenaries, and put off to meet Bomilcar. He found him at anchor with his ships headed for the African coast, and anxious to avoid a naval engagement, not because he was inferior in the strength or number of his ships, he really had more than the Romans, but because the winds were more favorable to them than to him. Episides, however, persuaded him to try his chance in a sea fight. When Marcellus became aware that an army of Sicilians was being raised from the whole of the island, and that a Carthaginian fleet was approaching with vast supplies, he determined, though inferior in the number of ships, to prevent Bomilcar from reaching Syracuse, lest he should be shut in by sea and land, whilst he was confined and hampered in a hostile city. The two fleets lay facing each other off the promontory of Pacanus, ready to engage as soon as the sea was calm enough to allow them to sail into deep water. As soon as the east wind, which had been blowing strongly for some days, dropped, Bomilcar made the first move. It seemed as though he was making for the open sea, in order the better to round the promontory, but when he saw the Roman ships sailing straight for him, he crowded on all sail, and skirting the coast of Sicily, made for Tarentum, having previously sent a message to Heraclea, ordering the transports to return to Africa. Finding all his hopes suddenly crushed, Episides did not care to go back to a city which was in a state of siege, and a large part of which was already taken. He sailed for Agrigentum to watch events rather than to control them. Chapter 28. When the news of what had happened reached the camp of the Sicilians, viz., that Episides had left Syracuse, and that the island had been abandoned by the Carthaginians, and almost surrendered a second time to the Romans, they sent envoys to Marcellus to treat for the surrender of the city, having previously sounded in frequent interviews the feelings of those who were undergoing the siege. They were practically united on these 2 points, that all that had been included in the king's dominions should belong to Rome, and that all else was to be retained by the Sicilians, together with their liberty and their laws. They then invited those who had been left in charge by Episides to a conference, the envoys telling them that the army of the Sicilians had sent them to them as well as to Marcellus, so that those who were within and those who were outside of the beleaguered city might share the same fortune, and neither should make separate terms for themselves. Admission was granted to them that they might converse with their friends and relatives. After explaining the nature of their understanding with Marcellus, and holding out a prospect of safety, they persuaded them to join in an attack upon those to whom Episides had committed the government, Polyclitus, Philistio, and Episides, surnamed Sindon. They were put to death, and the citizens were summoned to a public meeting. Here the envoys complained bitterly of the straits they were in for food, and the other evils which they had been in the habit of grumbling about in secret. They said that although they had so much to distress them, they must not throw the blame on fortune. It was in their own power to decide how long they would endure it. The motives which led the Romans to attack Syracuse were those of affection, not animosity. When they heard that the reins of government had been seized by Hippocrates and Episides, who had been first creatures of Hannibal and then of Hieronymus, they set their armies in motion and began the siege, not for the purpose of destroying the city, but of crushing those who were tyrannizing over it. But now that Hippocrates was disposed of, and Episides shut out from Syracuse, and his officers put to death, what was there left to prevent the Romans from wishing that Syracuse should be free from all harm, just as they would have wished it had Hiero, that eminently loyal friend of Rome, been still alive? There was, then, no danger either to the city or its people, other than that would arise from their own action, if they let slip that chance of reconciliation with Rome. There would never be another so favorable as the one they had at that moment, just when it was plain to all that Syracuse had been delivered from an impotent tyranny. Chapter 29. This address was received with universal approval. It was, however, decided to elect magistrates before sending the envoys. From amongst the magistrates so elected, they selected the envoys who were to be sent to Marcellus. Their leader addressed him in the following terms: "It is not we, the people of Syracuse, who have revolted from you, but Hieronymus, who acted much more wickedly towards us than towards you. And when peace had been restored by the tyrant's death, it was no Syracusan, but the king's creatures Hippocrates and Episides, who disturbed it, by crushing us on the one hand by fear, on the other by treachery. No man can say that there was ever a time during which we enjoyed liberty, when we were not at peace with you. Now, at all events, no sooner have we become our own masters through the death of the oppressors of Syracuse, than we come to you to give up our arms, to surrender ourselves, our city, and its fortifications, to accept any condition which you may lay upon us. To you, Marcellus, the gods have vouchsafed the glory of capturing the noblest and fairest of Grecian cities. Whatever memorable achievement we have wrought by sea or land enhances the splendor of your triumph. Would you wish that it should be only a glorious tradition how great a city you have captured, rather than that it should be a spectacle for the eyes of posterity to rest upon? That it should exhibit to all who visit it by land or sea the trophies we have won from Athenians and Carthaginians, which are now the trophies you have won from us? That you should hand down to your house an unharmed Syracuse, to be kept under the patronage and protection of all who bear the name of Marcellus. Let not the memory of Hieronymus weigh more with you than that of Hiero. He was your friend for a far longer time than the other was your enemy. You found in him a real benefactor. This man's madness only availed to his own destruction. As far as the Romans were concerned, they could have gained all they wanted in perfect security. It was amongst the besieged themselves that war existed with all its perils. The deserters, thinking that they were being betrayed, communicated their fears to the mercenaries. They all flew to arms, and beginning with the murder of the magistrates, they commenced a general massacre of the citizens, killing in their desperate madness everybody they met, and plundering all they could lay hands on. Then, that they might not be without officers, they elected 6, 3 to command in Acradina, and 3 in Nasos. When the tumult had somewhat subsided, and the mercenaries found out on inquiry what agreement had been come to with the Romans, the truth began to dawn upon them, and they realized that their case was quite distinct from that of the deserters. Chapter 30. The envoys came back from their interview with Marcellus just at the right moment, and were able to assure them that their suspicions were groundless, and that the Romans saw no reason why they should visit them with punishment. One of the 3 commanders in Acradina was a Spaniard named Moericus, and amongst those who accompanied the envoys, a soldier from the Spanish auxiliaries had designedly been introduced. When they had entered Acradina, this man obtained a private interview with Moericus, and described to him the state of affairs in Spain, which he had quite recently left, and how everything there was under the power of Rome. If Moericus chose to make himself of use to the Romans, he might be a leading man among his countrymen, and either take service under the Roman standard, or return to his own country, whichever he chose. But if on the other hand he preferred to remain under siege, what hope had he of relief, shut in as he was by sea and land? Moericus was impressed by the force of these arguments, and after it had been decided to send envoys to Marcellus, he sent his brother as one of them. The same Spanish soldier conducted him by himself to Marcellus. In this interview the details were settled, and Marcellus pledged himself to observe the conditions, after which the envoys returned to Agrippina. In order to avoid the least chance of suspicion, Moericus made it known that he disapproved of envoys going to and fro, and gave orders that none were to be admitted and none sent. Also, with a view to greater security, he thought that the conduct of the defense ought to be properly distributed amongst the 3 commanders, so that each might be responsible for his own section of the fortifications. They all agreed. In the division, his command extended from the fountain of Arethusa to the mouth of the great harbor, and he managed to let the Romans know that. So Marcellus ordered a cargo ship filled with troops to be towed by a quadrireme to the island, and the men to land near the gate adjoining the fountain. This order was carried out in the 4th watch, and Moericus, as previously arranged, admitted the soldiers through the gate. At dawn Marcellus attacked Agrippina with his full strength, and not only those who were actually holding it, but the troops in Naxos also, left their posts, and ran to defend Agrippina from the assault of the Romans. In the confusion of the attack, some swift vessels, which had previously been brought round to Naxos, landed troops. These, making an unexpected attack upon the half-manned posts, and rushing through the gates still open, out of which the garrison had just sallied to defend Agrippina, had little trouble in capturing a position which had been abandoned owing to the flight of its defenders. There were none who did less to defend the place, or to maintain their ground with any spirit, than the deserters. They did not even trust their own comrades, and fled in the middle of the fighting. When Marcellus learnt that Naxos was captured, and one district of Agrippina occupied, and that Moericus with his men had joined the Romans, he ordered the retreat to be sounded, for he was afraid that the royal treasure, the fame of which exceeded the reality, might fall into the hands of plunderers. Chapter 31. The impetuosity of the soldiers being thus checked, and time and opportunity given for the deserters in Agrippina to effect their escape, the Syracusans were at last relieved of their apprehensions, and opened the gates. They at once sent a deputation to Marcellus, with the one request that they and their children might remain unharmed. He called a council of war, to which he summoned the Syracusan refugees in the Roman camp, and made the following reply to the deputation. The crimes committed against the people of Rome during these last few years by those who have held Syracuse quite outweigh all the good services which Hiero rendered us during his 50 years' reign. Most of these, it is true, have recoiled on the heads of those who were guilty of them, and they have punished themselves for their breach of treaties far more severely than the Roman people could have wished. I have been for 3 years investing Syracuse, not that Rome may make the city her slave, but that the leaders of deserters and renegades may not keep it in a state of oppression and bondage. What the Syracusans could have done has been shown by those amongst them who have been living within the Roman lines, by the Spaniard Moericus, who brought over his men, and last of all by the belated but courageous resolution which the Syracusans have now taken. After all the toils and dangers which have endured for so long a time round the walls of Syracuse, by sea and land, the fact that I have been able to capture the city is nothing like such a reward as I should have received had I been able to save it. After giving this reply, he sent the quaestor with an escort to Naxos, to receive the royal treasure into his custody. Agrippina was given up for plunder to the soldiers, after guards had been placed at the houses of the refugees who were within the Roman lines. Amongst many horrible instances of fury and rapacity, the fate of Archimedes stands out. It is recorded that amidst all the uproar and terror created by the soldiers who were rushing about the captured city in search of plunder, he was quietly absorbed in some geometrical figures which he had drawn on the sand, and was killed by a soldier who did not know who he was. Marcellus was much grieved, and took care that his funeral was properly conducted, and after his relations had been discovered, they were honored and protected by the name and memory of Archimedes. Such in the main were the circumstances under which Syracuse was captured, and the amount of plunder was almost greater than if Carthage had been taken, the city which was waging war on equal terms with Rome. A few days prior to the capture of Syracuse, Titus Ottacilius crossed over from Lilybaeum to Utica with 80 quinqueremes. He entered the harbor before daylight, and captured some transports laden with corn, and then, landing his men, ravaged a considerable portion of the country round Utica, and carried back to his ships every description of plunder. He returned to Lilybaeum 3 days after he had started with 130 transports, laden with corn and booty. The corn he at once sent on to Syracuse. Had it not been for that timely assistance, victors and vanquished alike would have been in danger of a very serious famine. End of section 29. Section 30 of the History of Rome, Volume 3, by Livy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Rita Boutros. Book 25, The Fall of Syracuse, Chapters 32 through 41. Chapter 32, Roman Defeats in Spain, The Death of the Scipios. For 2 years nothing very remarkable had happened in Spain. The contest was carried on by diplomacy more than by arms. This summer the Roman commanders, on leaving their winter quarters, united their forces. A council of war was called, and they came to a unanimous decision that, as up to that time all they had done was to keep Hasdrubal from marching to Italy, it was now high time to make an effort to finish the war. During the winter they had raised a force of 20,000 Celtiberians, and with this reinforcement they considered themselves strong enough for the task. The enemy's force consisted of 3 armies. Hasdrubal, the son of Gisco, had united his army with Mago, and their joint camp was about a 5 days' march from the Romans. Somewhat nearer to them was Hasdrubal, the son of Hamilcar, an old commander in Spain, who was in camp at a city called Amtorgis. The Roman commanders wanted to dispose of him first, and they believed that they had more than enough strength for the purpose. The only doubt in their minds was whether, after his defeat, the other Hasdrubal and Mago would not retreat into the trackless forest and mountains, and keep up a guerrilla warfare. The best plan, they thought, would be to form their force into 2 armies, and finish the war in Spain at one stroke. They arranged accordingly that Publius Cornelius was to advance against Mago and Hasdrubal with 2/3 of the army of Romans and allied troops, and Gnaeus Cornelius with the remaining 1/3 of the old army, and the recently raised Celtiberians was to oppose the Barcine Hasdrubal. Both generals with their armies advanced together as far as the town of Amtorgis, where they encamped in full view of the enemy, with the river between them. Here Gnaeus Scipio took his stand with the force above mentioned, while Publius Scipio went on to execute his share of the operations. Chapter 33. When Hasdrubal became aware that the Romans formed only a small portion of the army, and that they were depending entirely upon their Celtiberian auxiliaries, he determined to detach the latter from their Roman service. He was quite at home with every form of treachery known to barbarians, and especially those practiced by the tribes amongst whom he had for so many years been campaigning. Both camps were full of Spaniards, who had no difficulty in understanding each other's language, and secret interviews were held, in the course of which he made an agreement with the Celtiberian chieftains, by the offer of a large bribe, that they should withdraw their forces. They did not look upon this as very atrocious conduct, for it was not a question of turning their arms against the Romans, and though the money was quite equal to the pay they received in war, it was given them to abstain from war. Then, too, the mere rest from the toils of the campaign, the thought of returning home, the delight of seeing their friends and their possessions, were universally welcomed, so the mass of the troops were quite as easily persuaded as their chiefs, and they had nothing to fear from the Romans, who were too few in number to keep them back by force. This is a thing against which Roman generals will always have to be on their guard, and instances such as these ought to serve as warnings that they must not depend upon foreign auxiliaries to such an extent as not to have in their camp a preponderance of that solidity and fighting power which native troops can alone supply. The Celtiberians took up their standards and marched off. The Romans asked them why they were going, and appealed to them to stay where they were, but the only answer they got was that they were called away by a war at home. When Scipio saw that his allies could not be detained by either appeals or force, and that without them he was no match for the enemy, whilst a junction with his brother was out of the question, he determined to retreat as far as he could. This seemed the only safe measure to adopt. His one object was to avoid an encounter on open ground with the enemy, who had crossed the river and were pressing closely at his heels. Chapter 34. Publius Scipio was at the same time placed in a position quite as alarming, but fraught with much greater danger, by the appearance of a new enemy. This was young Massinissa, at that time an ally of the Carthaginians, but afterwards raised to fame and power by his friendship with Rome. He first sought to check Scipio's advance with a body of Numidian horse, and he kept up incessant attacks upon him day and night. He not only cut off all who had wandered too far from camp in search of wood and fodder, but he actually rode up to the camp and charged into the middle of the outposts and pickets, creating alarm and confusion everywhere. In the night he frequently upset the camp by making a sudden rush at the gates and the stockade. There was no place and no time at which the Romans were free from anxiety and fear, and they were compelled to keep within their lines, unable to obtain anything they wanted. It was fast becoming a regular siege, and would evidently become a still closer one if Indebulus, who was reported to be approaching with 7,500 Suessitanians, should join the Carthaginians. Cautious and prudent general though he was, Scipio was compelled by his position to take the hazardous step of making a night march, to oppose Indebulus's advance, and to fight him wherever he met him. Leaving a small force to guard the camp, and placing Tiberius Fonteius in command, he started at midnight and encountered the enemy. They fought in order of march rather than of battle. The Romans, however, had the advantage, in spite of its being an irregular battle. But the Numidian horse, whom Scipio thought he had eluded, swept round both flanks and created the greatest alarm. A fresh action had now begun against the Numidians when a third enemy appeared. The Carthaginian generals had come up and were attacking the rear. The Romans had to face a battle on both flanks and on their rear, and could not make up their minds against what enemy to make their main attack, or in what direction to close their line and charge. Whilst their commander was fighting, and encouraging his men, and exposing himself in the hottest of the turmoil, he was run through by a lance in his left side. The massed body of the enemy who had charged the closed ranks round their general, as soon as they saw Scipio falling lifeless from his horse, were wild with joy, and ran in all directions, shouting that the Roman commander had fallen. The news spread over the whole field, and the enemy at once regarded themselves as unquestionably victorious, while the Romans equally felt themselves vanquished. With the loss of the general, there began at once a flight from the field. It was not difficult to break through the Numidians and other light-armed troops, but it was almost impossible to make one's escape amidst such numbers of cavalry and of foot soldiers, who rivaled horses in speed. Almost more were killed in flight than in battle, and not a man would have survived had not the day been rapidly drawing to a close, so that night put an end to the carnage. Chapter 35. The Carthaginian generals were not slow to take advantage of their success. After allowing their men the needful rest, they proceeded straight from the battlefield by forced marches to Hasdrubal, fully expecting that when they had joined forces the war could be brought to a close. When they reached his camp, the generals and the soldiers, in high spirits over their recent victory, exchanged hearty congratulations at the destruction of so great a commander and his entire army, and looked forward with confidence to winning another victory as complete. The report of the terrible disaster had not reached the Romans, but there was a gloomy silence, a secret foreboding, such as usually happens when men feel a presentiment of coming misfortune. The general, who saw himself deserted by his allies, and knew that the forces of the enemy were so largely augmented, was led still further by his own conjectures and inferences to suspect the occurrence of some disaster much sooner than to entertain any hopes of success. How, he asked himself, could Hasdrubal and Mago have brought up their army without opposition, if they had not brought their own share of the war to a successful close? How could his brother have failed to stop them, or to follow them up so that, if he could not prevent their forming a junction, he could at least have united his own forces with those of his brother? Filled with these anxieties, he believed that the only safe course for him for the time being was to retreat from his present position as far as he could. He accordingly accomplished a considerable march in a single night, unobserved by the enemy, and therefore unmolested. When it grew light, the enemy became aware of his departure, and sending on the Numidians in advance, commenced the pursuit with the utmost speed of which they were capable. The Numidians came up with them before nightfall, and by making repeated charges on flank and rear, compelled them to come to a halt and defend themselves. Scipio, however, urged them to fight as well as they could, and keep moving forward before they were overtaken by the infantry. Chapter 36. As, however, what with fighting and halting, they had for some time been making very little progress, and night was close at hand, Scipio called his men off from battle, massed them in close order, and led them to some rising ground, not indeed a very safe position, especially for unnerved troops, but still somewhat more elevated than the ground round it. The baggage and the cavalry were placed in the center, and the infantry drawn up round them, and at first they had no difficulty in repelling the attacks of the Numidians. But when the three commanders appeared in full force with 3 regular armies, it was obvious that they would be unable to defend the position by arms alone in the absence of entrenchments. The general began to look round him and consider whether it were in any way possible to surround himself with an earthwork. But the hill was so bare and the ground so rocky that there was no brushwood to cut for a stockade, nor earth for constructing a rampart, or carrying a fosse, or for any other work. No part was naturally so steep or precipitous as to render the approach or ascent difficult for the enemy. The whole surface of the hill rose in a gentle slope. In order, however, to present to the enemy something which might look like a rampart, they tied together their saddles and the packs which the animals carried, and piled them up all round them, as if they were building up a rampart to the usual height. And where there were not enough saddles, they made it up by throwing all the kits and packages of every kind into the gaps as a barricade. When the Carthaginian armies came up, their column had no difficulty in mounting the hill, but they stopped short at the sight of the novel defense, as though it were something uncanny. Their officers shouted out on all sides, "Why are you stopping? Why do you not tear down and demolish that juggler's trick, which is hardly strong enough to stop women and children? The enemy, hiding behind his baggage, is caught and held." But in spite of the taunts and sarcasms of the officers, it was anything but easy either to clamber over or to push away the heavy obstacles in front of them, or to cut through the tightly packed saddles, buried as they were beneath the baggage. After a considerable time they succeeded in forcing away the heavy obstacles, and opened a way for the troops, and when they had done this in several places, the camp was rushed on all sides and captured. The little band of defenders were slaughtered by the masses of the enemy, helpless in the hands of their victors. Still, a good many found refuge in the neighboring woods, and escaped to Publius Scipio's camp, where Tiberius Fonteius was in command. Some traditions assert that Gnaeus Scipio was killed in the first onset of the enemy on the hill. According to others, he escaped to a tower near the camp, and as they were unable to break down the door with all their efforts, they lighted fires against it, and after it was burnt away, they slew all inside, including the commander. Gnaeus Scipio was killed after he had been 8 years in Spain, and 29 days after his brother's death. The grief felt at their death was as great throughout Spain as it was in Rome. The city had to mourn not only for them, but for the loss of its armies, the defection of the province, and the blow inflicted on the Republic. In Spain it was the generals themselves whose loss was so bitterly felt, more so in the case of Gnaeus, because he had held his command there for a longer time. He too was the first to win popularity amongst the people, the first to show what Roman justice and Roman self-control and moderation really meant. Chapter 37. Lucius Marcius restores the prestige of Rome. With the destruction of the armies, it seemed as though Spain must be lost. But one man restored the fallen fortunes of the state. There was in the army a Lucius Marcius, the son of Septimius, a Roman knight, an active and energetic youth, whose character and abilities were somewhat superior to the position in which he had been born. His many natural gifts had been developed by Scipio's training, under whom he had learnt all the arts of war. Out of the fugitive soldiers whom he had rallied, and some whom he had drawn from the garrisons in Spain, he had formed quite a respectable army, and with it had joined Tiberius Fonteius, Scipio's lieutenant. After they had entrenched themselves in a camp on this side of the Ebro, the soldiers decided to hold a regular election for the purpose of choosing a general to command the united armies, and they relieved each other on sentinel and outpost duty, so that every man might give his vote. So far did the Roman knight surpass all others in the authority and respect which he possessed with the soldiers, that the whole army unanimously conferred the supreme command on Lucius Marcius. After this, he spent the whole of the time, and short enough it was, in strengthening the defenses of the camp and storing supplies in it. And the soldiers carried out all his commands with alacrity, and in anything but a despondent mood. But when the news arrived that Hasdrubal, Gisco's son, had crossed the Ebro, and was coming to stamp out the remains of the war, and the soldiers saw the signal for battle put out by their new general, they gave way completely. The recollection of the men who had so lately commanded them, the proud confidence which they had always felt in their generals and their armies when they went into battle, quite unnerved them. They all burst into tears and smote their heads. Some raised their hands to heaven and reproached the gods. Others lay on the ground and invoked the names of their old commanders. Nothing could check these wild outbursts of grief, though the centurions tried to rouse their men, and Marcius himself went about calming them, and at the same time reproaching them for their unmanly conduct. Why, he asked them, have you given way to womanish and idle tears, instead of bracing yourselves up to defend yourselves and the Republic, and not allowing your commander's death to go unavenged? Suddenly a shout was heard, and the sound of trumpets, for the enemy was now close up to the rampart. In an instant their grief changed to fury. They rushed to arms, and racing to the gates like madmen, they dashed upon the enemy, who were coming on carelessly and in disorder. The sudden and unlooked-for movement created a panic among the Carthaginians. They wondered whence all these enemies had arisen, after their army had been all but annihilated. What gave such daring and self-confidence to men who had been vanquished and put to flight, who had come forward as their commander now that the 2 Scipios were killed, who was over the camp, who had given the signal for battle? Bewildered and astounded at all these utterly unlooked-for surprises, they at first slowly retired. Then, as the attack became heavier and more insistent, they turned and fled. There would have been either a frightful slaughter amongst the fugitives, or a rash and dangerous attack on the part of the pursuers, if Marcius had not hurriedly given the signal to retire, and kept back the excited troops by throwing himself in front of the foremost, and even holding some back with his hands. Then he marched them back to camp, still thirsting for blood. When the Carthaginians saw that none were pursuing them after the first repulse from the rampart, they imagined that they had been afraid to go any further. Their feelings of contempt returned, and they marched at a leisurely pace back to their camp. They showed as much carelessness in guarding their own camp as they had shown in attacking the Roman, for although their enemy was near them, they regarded them as only the wreckage of 2 armies which had been destroyed a few days before. Whilst they were, in consequence of this, neglectful of everything, Marcius, who had become thoroughly aware of it, thought out a plan, at first glance hazardous rather than bold, which was to assume the aggressive and attack the enemy's camp. He thought it would be easier to storm Hasdrubal's camp whilst he was alone than to defend his own, in case the 3 commanders united their forces once more. Besides, if he succeeded, he would have gone far to retrieve their late disasters. If he failed, the enemy could no longer despise him, since he would have been the first to attack. Chapter 38. His plan seemed a desperate one, considering the position he was in, and might easily be upset by some unforeseen incident creating a panic in the night. To guard against these dangers as far as possible, he thought it well to address some words of encouragement to his men. He called them together and made the following speech to them. My loyalty and affection for my old commanders, whether living or dead, as well as the situation in which we now find ourselves, ought to convince every one of you soldiers that this command, honorable as you rightly deem it to be, is, as a matter of fact, a position of very grave anxiety. For at a moment when I was hardly sufficient master of myself, did not fear dull the sense of pain, to find any comfort in my distress, I saw myself compelled to take thought alone for you all, the hardest thing in the world in a time of grief. Even when I have to consider how I can possibly preserve for my country you who are all that remain out of 2 armies, it is still a grief to have to divert my thoughts from a sorrow that is ever with me. Bitter memories vex me. The 2 Scipios haunt me in anxious thoughts by day and in dreams at night. They rouse me from my slumbers and forbid me to suffer them or their soldiers, your own comrades, who never for 8 years knew defeat in these lands, or the Republic to remain unavenged. They call upon me to follow their example and act on the principles they laid down, as no man obeyed them more faithfully while they lived. So now that they are gone, they would have me think that what they would have done on any occasion that arose is the best thing for me also to do. And I would have you, my soldiers, not follow them with tears and laments, as though they had ceased to be, for they live and are strong in the glory of all that they have done, but go into battle thinking of them, as if they were here to encourage you and give you the signal. Surely it was nothing else than their image before your eyes which brought about that memorable battle yesterday, in which you showed your enemy that the Roman name did not perish with the Scipios, and that a people whose strength and courage even Cannae could not crush, will rise superior to the hardest blows of fortune. Well, as you showed such daring yesterday on your own account, I want now to see if you will show as much daring at the bidding of your commander. When I gave the signal yesterday to recall you from your hot pursuit of your disordered foe, it was from no wish to damp your courage, but to reserve it for a greater and more glorious occasion, when you will shortly be able, prepared, and armed, to fall upon the enemy when he is off his guard, without his arms, and even wrapped in slumbers. And in thus hoping, I am not trusting simply to chance, but have good grounds for what I say. If anyone were to ask you how, few as you are, you manage to defend your camp against a mighty host, how, after your defeat, you are able to repel those who had defeated you from your rampart, you would, I am sure, reply that this was the very danger you feared, and therefore you strengthened your defenses in every possible way, and held yourselves at your posts in readiness. And such is generally the case. Men are least safe when their circumstances give them no cause for fear. What you think of no importance you leave open and unguarded. There is nothing which the enemy are less afraid of than that we, who were lately surrounded and attacked, should of our own motion attack their camp. Let us venture where no one can believe we will venture. The fact that it is thought too difficult will make it all the easier. I will lead you out in a silent march at the 3rd watch of the night. I have ascertained that they have no proper arrangement of sentinels and pickets. When once our shout is heard in their gates, the camp will be carried at the first rush. Then, whilst they are heavy with sleep, panic struck at the unlooked-for tumult, and surprised defenseless in their beds, that slaughter will take place amongst them from which you were, to your intense disappointment, recalled yesterday. I know that the plan seems a daring one, but in difficult circumstances, which leave little to hope for, the boldest measures are always the safest. If, when the critical moment comes, you hang back ever so little, and do not catch the opportunity as it flies past, You will look for it in vain when once you have let it go. There is one army near us. 2 more are not very far away. If we attack them now, there is some hope for us. You have already tried your strength against theirs. If we put off the day, and after yesterday's sortie are no longer regarded with contempt, there is the danger of all the generals and their armies uniting. In that case, shall we withstand the 3 generals, the 3 armies, which Gnaeus Scipio did not withstand when his army was in its full strength? As our generals perished owing to their forces being divided, so the enemy can be crushed in detail while they are divided. There is no other way of carrying on war. Let us, then, wait for nothing beyond the opportunity of the coming night. Now go, trusting to the help of the gods, and get food and rest, so that, fresh and vigorous, you may break into the enemy's camp in the same courageous spirit in which you defended your own. They were delighted to hear this new plan from their new general, and the more daring it was, the more it pleased them. The rest of the day was spent in getting their arms ready, and in looking after themselves. At the 4th watch they began to move. Chapter 39. The other Carthaginian forces were about 6 miles beyond the camp nearest to the Romans. Between them lay a valley thickly wooded, and on some ground about halfway through the wood, a Roman cohort, adopting Punic tactics, concealed themselves with some cavalry. After the road was thus occupied midway, the rest of the force marched in silence to the enemy nearest to them, and as there were no outposts in front of the gates, and no guard mounted, they penetrated without any opposition into the camp, just as if they were entering their own. Then the signals were sounded, and the battle shout raised. Some slew the enemy while half asleep. Others threw firebrands onto their huts, which were thatched with dry straw. Others held the gates to intercept the fugitives. The fire, the shouting, and the slaughter, all combined, bereft the enemy almost of their senses, and prevented them from either hearing one another on taking any measures for their safety. Without arms themselves, they fell amongst troops of armed men. Some rushed to the gates, others, finding the ways blocked, sprang over the rampart, and all who escaped in this way fled at once to the other camp, where they were met by the cohort and the cavalry running out from their concealment, and all cut down to a man. Even if anyone had escaped from the carnage, the Romans, after taking that camp, ran on so swiftly to the other one that no one could get there before them to announce the disaster. When they got to the second camp, they found neglect and disorder everywhere, partly owing to its greater distance from them, and partly because some of the defenders had dispersed in quest of fodder and wood and plunder. At the outposts the arms were actually piled. The soldiers, all unarmed, were sitting and lying about on the ground, or walking up and down in front of the gates and rampart. In this state of careless disorder they were assailed by the Romans, who were tired by their recent fighting, and flushed with victory. It was impossible to hold the gates against them, and once within the gates a desperate battle began. At the first alarm there was a rush from all parts of the camp, and there would have been a long and obstinate struggle if the Carthaginians had not seen in the blood-stained shields of the Romans plain traces of the former contest, which filled them with dismay and terror. They all turned and fled wherever they could find the way open to escape, and all but those who had been already killed were driven out of the camp. So in a night and a day 2 of the enemy's camps had been carried under the leadership of Lucius Marcius. According to Claudius, who translated the annals of Acilius from Greek into Latin, as many as 37,000 of the enemy were slain, 1,830 being prisoners, besides an immense amount of plunder. The latter included a silver shield 137 pounds in weight, together with a statuette of Hasdrubal. Valerius Antius relates that only Mago's camp was taken, when the enemy lost 7,000 killed. In the other battle, when the Romans made the sortie and fought with Hasdrubal, 10,000 were killed, and 4,380 made prisoners. Piso says that 5,000 men were killed when Mago was ambushed while recklessly pursuing our men. All these authors dwell upon the greatness of Marsyas, and they exaggerate the glory he really won by describing a supernatural incident. Whilst he was addressing his troops, they say that a flame shot from his head, without his being aware of it, to the great terror of the soldiers standing round. It is also stated that there was in the temple on the Capitol, before it was burnt, a shield called the Marsian, with a statuette of Hasdrubal as memorials of his victory. For some time after this, matters were quiet in Spain, neither side, after the defeats they had suffered, being anxious to risk a decisive action. Chapter 40. The Campaign in Sicily. While these events were occurring in Spain, Marcellus, after the capture of Syracuse, settled the affairs of Sicily with so much justice and integrity as to enhance not merely his own reputation, but the greatness and dignity of Rome as well. He removed to Rome the ornaments of the city, the statues and pictures in which Syracuse abounded. They were, it is true, spoils taken from the enemy and acquired by the laws of war, but that was the beginning of our admiration for Greek works of art, which has led to the present reckless spoliation of every kind of treasure, sacred and profane alike. This has at last recoiled upon the gods of Rome, upon that temple especially which Marcellus so splendidly adorned. For the shrines near the Capena gate, which Marcellus dedicated, used to be visited by strangers on account of the very beautiful specimens of that class of ornament, but very few are to be seen today. Whilst Marcellus was settling the affairs of Sicily, deputations from nearly all the communities in the island visited him. The treatment they received varied with their circumstances. Those who had not revolted, or had returned to our friendship prior to the capture of Syracuse, were welcomed and honored as loyal allies. Those who, after its capture, had surrendered through fear, had to accept the terms which the victor imposes on the vanquished. The Romans, however, had considerable remnants of the war still on their hands round Agrigentum. There were still left in the field the generals Epicides and Hanno, who had commanded in the late war, and a fresh general who had been sent in place of Hippocrates by Hannibal, a man of Liby-Phoenician nationality called Hippocratanus. His fellow countrymen called him Mutinis, a man of energy and enterprise, who had had a thorough military training under that master of war Hannibal. He was furnished by Epicides and Hanno with a force of Numidians, and with these troopers he committed such extensive depredations on the lands of those who were hostile, and was so active in keeping his friends loyal by always bringing them help at the right moment, that in a short time all Sicily had heard of him, and there was no one from whom the supporters of Carthage expected greater things. Up to that time, Epicides and Hanno had been compelled to keep within the fortifications of Agrigentum. Now, however, in a spirit of self-confidence, quite as much as in compliance with the advice of Mutinis, they ventured outside and fixed their camp by the Himera. No sooner was this reported to Marcellus than he promptly moved up and encamped about 4 miles from the enemy, with the intention of waiting for any action he might take. But no time was allowed him for either delay or deliberation. Mutinis crossed the river and charged his enemy's outposts, creating the greatest terror and confusion. The next day there was almost a regular battle, and he drove the Romans within their lines. Then he was recalled by tidings of a mutiny which had broken out amongst the Numidians in Hanno's camp. Nearly 300 of them had gone off to Heraclea, Minoa. When he left the camp to reason with them and recall them, he is said to have most earnestly advised the generals not to engage the enemy in his absence. They both resented this, more especially Hanno, who had long been jealous of Mutine's reputation. "Is Mutines," he exclaimed, "to dictate to me, a low-born African, to give orders to a Carthaginian general, bearing the commission of the Senate and people?" Episides wished to wait, but he brought him over to his view, that they should cross the river and offer battle. For, he argued, if they waited for Mutines, and then fought a successful action, he would undoubtedly get all the credit for it. Chapter 41. Marcellus was of course intensely indignant at the idea of the man who had turned Hannibal, flushed with his victory at Cannae, aside from Nola, now giving way before enemies whom he had defeated by sea and land, and he ordered his men to seize their arms at once and march out in order of battle. Whilst he was forming his lines, 10 Numidians from the opposing army galloped up to him at full speed, with the announcement that their countrymen would take no part in the fighting. First, because they sympathized with the 300 mutineers who had gone to Heraclea, and secondly, because they saw that their leader had been got rid of, on the very day of battle, by generals who wanted to cast a cloud on his reputation. Deceitful as that nation usually is, they kept their promise on that occasion. The news flew quickly through the ranks that the cavalry, of whom they stood in greatest fear, had left the enemy in the lurch, and their courage rose accordingly. The enemy, on the other hand, were in a great state of alarm, because not only were they losing the support of their strongest arm, but there was a chance of their being attacked by their own cavalry. So there was not much of a conflict. The action was decided by the first battle shout and charge. When the opposing lines met, the Numidians were standing quietly on the wings. When they saw their own side turn tail, they joined them in their flight for a short distance. But when they saw them making in all haste for Agrigentum, they dispersed to all the neighboring cities, for fear of having to stand a siege. Several thousand men were killed, and 8 elephants captured. This was the last battle Marcellus fought in Sicily. After his victory he returned to Syracuse. As the year was now almost at an end, the Senate decreed that the praetor Publius Cornelius should send instructions to the consuls at Capua, for one of them, if they approved, to come to Rome, to appoint new magistrates, while Hannibal was at a distance, and no very critical operations were going on at Capua. After receiving the dispatch, the consuls came to a mutual arrangement that Claudius should conduct the elections, and Fulvius remain at Capua. The new consuls were Gnaeus Fulvius Centimallus, and Publius Sulpicius Galba, the son of Servius, a man who had never before filled a curial office. The election of praetors followed. Those elected were Lucius Cornelius Lentulus, Marcus Cornelius Cethegus, Gaius Sulpicius, and Gaius Calpurnius Piso. Piso took over the urban jurisdiction. Sicily was allotted to Sulpicius, Apulia to Cethegus, Sardinia to Lentulus. The consuls had their commands extended for another year. End of Section 30. End of The History of Rome, Volume 3, by Livy.